The freight train's whistle screamed across the New Mexico Badlands like a banshee's wail before the locomotive erupted in a thunderous explosion that painted the twilight sky in shades of hell. 8-year-old Lila Crawford pressed herself deeper into the twisted wreckage of the cargo car, her small hands clamped over her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to betray her hiding place to the masked riders who moved through the devastation like angels of death. The acrid smoke burned her lungs and stung her eyes, but terror kept her motionless as boots crunched through debris just yards from her sanctuary. Through gaps in the twisted metal, she watched the methodical execution of survivors, men, women, and children cut down without mercy as they crawled from the burning wreckage. When the lead rider reached her parents' bodies near the passenger car, he knelt with the reverence of a mourner rather than the callousness of a killer. With deliberate slowness, he pulled off his black bandana, revealing a face that shattered Lila's understanding of everything she thought she knew about good and evil. Uncle Marcus, her father's beloved twin brother, the man who had taught her to ride horses and carved wooden toys for her birthdays, stood over Captain James Crawford's corpse, with smoking pistol in hand. But his face was not that of a cold-blooded murderer. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, and his lips moved in what might have been a prayer or a desperate apology. "I'm sorry, James." Marcus whispered, his voice breaking with genuine anguish. "God forgive me for what they've made me do. God forgive us all." He knelt and pressed something into her father's lifeless palm, a silver pendant that caught the firelight like a falling star. Then he rose and called out to his men, with a voice that carried no conviction. "Find the girl. James's daughter cannot live to tell what she's seen here tonight." But as his riders began their methodical search, Marcus's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would start toward one section of wreckage, then veer away, as if fighting some invisible force. When a subordinate questioned his orders, Marcus snapped with barely controlled desperation. "The child dies tonight. Those are my instructions, and any man who fails to follow them will answer to me personally." Yet his actions contradicted his words. Each time a searcher drew close to Lila's hiding place, Marcus would call them away, with some urgent task or false lead. It was as if two different souls warred within the same body, one driven by duty to an unnamed master, and the other rebelling against orders that violated every principle he had once held sacred. The confusion gave Lila precious time to study her surroundings and plan an escape. The cargo car had come to rest against a boulder field that offered concealment if she could reach it without being seen. But between her hiding place and safety lay 30 yards of open ground illuminated by the burning wreckage. As the searchers moved closer, Marcus suddenly mounted his horse and rode to a position where he could see both Lila's refuge and his men's locations. For a moment, their eyes met through a gap in the twisted metal, and she saw something that confused her even more than his presence at the massacre. A look of profound sorrow, mixed with what might have been relief. "We've searched everywhere, Colonel," one of the riders reported. "If there was a child in this wreck, she's been burned to nothing or carried off by coyotes." Marcus stared directly at Lila's hiding place for what felt like an eternity before nodding slowly. "Then our work here is finished. Mount up, we ride for the border before the cavalry arrives to investigate." As the riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, Marcus lingered for one final moment. His voice, barely audible above the crackling flames, carried words that would haunt Lila for days to come. "Your father was a better man than any of us deserved. Remember that, child. Remember that some battles are fought not to win, but to preserve whatever goodness remains in this world." Then he too vanished into the night, leaving Lila alone with the dead and the dying echoes of a life that had ended in blood and mystery. She waited another hour before emerging from her sanctuary, using lessons her father had taught her about patience and observation to ensure the killers had truly gone. When she finally crept toward her parents' bodies, she found the pendant Marcus had placed in her father's palm, an intricate piece of Navajo silverwork, that seemed to pulse with significance in the starlight. But discovery of the pendant was not her only shock. Hidden beneath her father's body was a leather satchel that the killers had somehow missed, containing papers and photographs that suggested Captain James Crawford had been investigating something far more dangerous than routine patrol duties. As coyotes began to howl in the distance, and the desert reclaimed its ancient silence, Lila Crawford started walking toward an uncertain future, carrying secrets that powerful men had killed to conceal, and questions that would reshape her understanding of family loyalty and the complex moral landscape of the American frontier. The pendant grew warm against her skin as she walked, as if responding to some unseen presence that watched over her journey into the vast emptiness of the New Mexico wilderness. Behind her, the train wreck burned like a funeral pyre for innocence itself, while ahead lay a road that would test every assumption she had ever held about the difference between good and evil. 3 days of merciless sun and bone-deep thirst had reduced Lila to a walking scarecrow when she stumbled onto the dusty trading road that connected Santa Fe to the military outposts scattered throughout the territory. Her once pristine blue dress hung in tatters from her diminished frame, the Crawford family crest barely visible through the accumulated grime of her desperate journey. The leather satchel had become both anchor and salvation. During her ordeal, its weight a constant reminder of the burden she carried, while its contents provided the motivation to keep moving when exhaustion threatened to claim her. She had not dared to examine the papers fully, but glimpses of official seals and urgent handwriting suggested they contained information worth dying for. 5 wagon trains had passed her by that morning. The first, a family of German immigrants with children of their own, had slowed just long enough for the mother to cross herself and whisper about another frontier orphan, before whipping their oxen to greater speed. A merchant caravan had been more direct in their rejection. The trail boss calling out, "We got no room for strays, girl. Find your own way home." Most painful had been the cavalry patrol that rode past, without stopping their sergeant taking one look at her bedraggled appearance, and dismissing her with words that cut deeper than any physical wound. Just another half-breed bastard abandoned by her savage father. Territory's full of them these days. The sun had reached its merciless zenith when hoofbeats approached from the western hills. Through the heat, shimmer Lila could make out a lone rider on a paint horse, his posture suggesting someone familiar with hard travel and harder choices. As he drew closer, she could see the ritual scars that marked him as Navajo, along with fresh bandages wrapped around his left shoulder where some recent violence had left its mark. Tse Begay had been riding for 3 days since a bounty hunting job went wrong near the Colorado border, leaving him wounded and nearly penniless in a territory that showed little mercy to his people. His water was almost gone, his horse was favoring its right foreleg, and his prospects for survival looked as bleak as those of the white child who now stumbled before him on the dusty road. Every instinct told him to ride past without stopping. In this harsh land, charity was a luxury few could afford, especially toward children whose people had shown no mercy to his own. The scars on his face and body told the story of a dozen encounters with white civilization, each one reinforcing the lesson that survival depended on trusting no one outside his own tribe. But something about the child's demeanor gave him pause. Despite her obvious desperation, she held herself with a dignity that transcended her circumstances. There was intelligence in her eyes, along with a pain so profound that it reminded him of his own reflection after watching soldiers burn his village 12 years ago. "Please," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "I don't want to die out here." Tse reined in his horse and studied her more carefully. The child was clearly well born. Her speech carried the careful diction of education, and beneath the grime, her features held a delicate beauty that spoke of privileged breeding. Most telling was the silver pendant at her throat, its intricate Navajo craftsmanship suggesting connections that went beyond simple theft or trade. "What is your name, little one?" he asked in careful English, his accent thick with the cadences of his native tongue. Lila Crawford. She flinched as if expecting a blow. My papa was Captain James Crawford of the Territorial Cavalry. Bad men killed him and Mama 3 days ago. They're looking for me. The name Crawford hit Tse like a rifle bullet to the chest. That family had been the architects of his people's suffering for over a decade, their military campaigns designed to clear Navajo lands for white settlement and railroad development. Captain William Crawford in particular had earned a reputation for brutality that made even hardened frontier soldiers uncomfortable. But this child spoke of James Crawford, not William. And there was something in her manner that suggested she had been a victim rather than a beneficiary of her family's reputation. The pendant at her throat only deepened the mystery. Such pieces were not sold or traded, but given only to family members as symbols of unbreakable bonds. You said bad men killed your parents. Tse said, dismounting to offer her water from his dwindling supply. Tell me about these men. Lila accepted the water gratefully, drinking with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned to ration every drop. Uncle Marcus led them, she said between swallows. He shot Papa himself, but he was crying while he did it. Like someone was making him do something terrible. She pulled out the pendant with trembling fingers. Before they left, Uncle Marcus put this in Papa's hand. I took it because Papa always said gifts from the heart should never be left behind. Tse's breath caught as he examined the pendant more closely. The craftsmanship was unmistakably his grandfather's work, a ceremonial piece that had disappeared from his family's belongings during the raid that killed his mother. Such pendants were always made in pairs, sacred bonds between loved ones that could survive even death itself. Reaching inside his shirt, Tse withdrew its twin, identical in every detail, except for the wear patterns of 15 years. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche of revelation and confusion. If this child carried his grandfather's work, if she spoke of a Crawford who had died protecting rather than persecuting, where did your father serve? Tse asked quietly. What was his assignment in the territory? Papa wasn't like the other soldiers. Lila replied with the earnest precision of a child recounting important information. He spent most of his time talking to Indian leaders, trying to prevent fights instead of starting them. He said the real enemies were the men who got rich from war, not the people who just wanted to live in peace. The contradiction between this description and everything Tse knew about the Crawford family created a cognitive dissonance that left him reeling. Could it be possible that not all Crawfords were cut from the same cloth, that this child's father had been fighting against the very system that had destroyed Tse's family? The men who killed your parents? Tse pressed. Did they say anything about why your father had to die? Lila's expression grew troubled as she struggled with memories too painful and complex for a child to fully understand. Uncle Marcus kept saying Papa was betraying the family honor, that he was sharing secrets with people who wanted to hurt us. But Papa never hurt anybody. He spent all his time trying to help people talk instead of fight. The pieces of a larger puzzle began to arrange themselves in Tse's mind. If James Crawford had been working to prevent conflicts rather than provoke them, if he had been killed by his own family for his efforts, then this child might be the key to understanding a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple frontier violence. But she was also a Crawford descendant of the family that had brought such suffering to his people. The rational part of his mind demanded that he leave her to the desert's mercy, let fate settle the blood debt that existed between their families. Yet as he looked into her pain-filled eyes, he saw not his enemy, but an echo of his lost sister Ayanna, who had been the same age when the soldiers came. We must reach Fort Marcy before sunset. Tse said, finally lifting Lila onto his horse. There are questions that need answers and enemies that grow closer with each passing hour. As they rode toward the adobe walls that marked the edge of civilization, neither realized they were about to uncover a conspiracy that would test every assumption they held about family loyalty and the true meaning of justice in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. Fort Marcy squatted on its high mesa like a wounded beast, its adobe walls scarred by decades of Apache raids and Comanche war parties. The stars and stripes hung limp in the stifling air as Tse carried the unconscious Lila through the main gate, her fevered body radiating heat like a coal from hell's own furnace. The sentries recognized Tse as a sometimes ally tracker who had helped locate missing wagon trains in exchange for medical supplies for his people. But bringing a white child to the fort was unprecedented, especially one bearing the Crawford family name and the unmistakable signs of deliberate violence rather than accidental injury. Sergeant Patrick Murphy emerged from the guardhouse with the cautious efficiency of a 20-year veteran who had learned to expect trouble in every situation. At 45, the grizzled Irishman had seen enough frontier violence to recognize the difference between victims and survivors, and this child clearly fell into both categories. Sweet Mother of God, Murphy breathed, recognizing the Crawford crest despite its tattered condition. That's Captain James Crawford's little one. We heard reports about a train attack, but word came down that there were no survivors. Our word came from whom? Tse asked sharply, his tracker's instincts alerting him to potential danger in official channels. Territorial Command in Santa Fe, Murphy replied, then paused as the implications sank in. But if the child's alive, then somebody's been spreading false information. And in this territory, false information usually means someone's got something to hide. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley emerged from the infirmary with the brisk efficiency that had saved countless lives on this violent frontier. At 38, she was one of the few female physicians in the territory, having earned her position through a combination of medical brilliance and the kind of frontier pragmatism that could set bones while dodging Apache arrows. Bring her inside. Dr. Hartley ordered, taking charge with the authority that came from being the final arbiter between life and death for hundreds of miles in any direction. And someone find Colonel Webb. This situation is about to become very complicated, very quickly. As Dr. Hartley worked to stabilize Lila's condition, her experienced hands noted injuries that raised disturbing questions about the nature of the attack. These aren't accident wounds, she informed Tse quietly. Someone tried to kill this child specifically. The cuts are too precise, too deliberate to be random violence. Colonel Harrison Webb arrived within the hour, his weathered face bearing the weight of too many years fighting wars that seemed to create more enemies than they destroyed. At 58, Webb had served on every frontier from Texas to Montana, watching the West transform from wilderness to civilization, one bloody mile at a time. Begay, Webb acknowledged with a respectful nod reserved for competent professionals. I assume you didn't bring Captain Crawford's daughter here for a social visit. She says her Uncle Marcus led the men who killed her parents, Tse replied. She also carries this. He showed Webb the Navajo pendant, watching the colonel's expression shift from professional interest to genuine alarm. Webb was one of the few Army officers who had bothered to learn about local tribal customs, and he recognized the significance of sacred family bonds that transcended cultural boundaries. Captain James Crawford was conducting a sensitive investigation when he died, Webb said carefully. His final report suggested he had discovered evidence of a conspiracy involving arms trafficking and corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. As Lila's fever broke on the second day, she began to speak with increasing clarity about the attack and its aftermath. Her memories painted a picture of betrayal and manipulation that went far beyond simple family violence or random frontier banditry. Papa kept arguing with Uncle Marcus about something called the operation. Lila told them in a voice still hoarse from her ordeal. Uncle Marcus would come to our house late at night, and they would talk in Papa's study for hours. Uncle Marcus always looked sick and scared, like he was being forced to do things he didn't want to do. Dr. Hartley leaned forward with professional interest. Can you describe how your uncle looked during these visits? Was he taking any kind of medicine? He had little bottles that he drank from. Lila replied. Papa said Uncle Marcus was sick with soldiers' sadness from the war, and that the medicine was supposed to help him sleep. But Papa was worried because Uncle Marcus needed more and more medicine to feel better. Webb and Dr. Hartley exchanged meaningful glances. They had both seen what laudanum addiction could do to a man's judgment, how it could turn even decent soldiers into creatures willing to commit atrocities for their next dose. But laudanum was expensive, and controlled someone with significant resources would have been needed to supply Marcus Crawford's dependency. There's something else. Lila continued pulling the leather satchel from beneath her makeshift bedding. Papa hid this under his body during the attack. The bad men were looking for papers, but they didn't find these. The satchel contained a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. Official correspondence, financial records, and detailed maps showed a network of corruption that reached from territorial politicians to railroad executives, all centered around a systematic campaign to eliminate tribal claims to mineral-rich lands. Your father was documenting evidence of arms trafficking to Apache war bands, Webb explained as he studied the papers. But not by random gun runners, by someone within the territorial government who was deliberately escalating conflicts to justify military intervention and land seizures. The maps showed planned attacks on tribal schools and ceremonial gatherings, each assault designed to provoke retaliation that would justify even harsher measures against all Native American populations. The ultimate goal was complete tribal removal, clearing millions of acres for railroad development and mineral extraction. But the most shocking discovery was a series of photographs showing clandestine meetings between territorial officials and Mexican cartel leaders. The images revealed that weapons were being sold to both sides of the conflict, ensuring maximum bloodshed while generating profits for the conspirators. "Look at this," Dr. Hartley said, pointing to financial records that showed regular payments to someone identified only as MC. Large sums transferred monthly for the past 18 months, always coinciding with reported Apache raids or tribal conflicts. Tse studied the dates with growing recognition. These payments matched the timeline of attacks on Navajo settlements. He said grimly, "Someone has been funding violence against my people while making it look like random Apache hostility." But the documents raised as many questions as they answered. The conspiracy was clearly extensive and well-funded, but the identity of its leadership remained hidden behind code names and financial intermediaries. James Crawford had been getting close to the truth when he was silenced, but his investigation was incomplete. "There's more," Lila said, producing a small brass key from the satchel's inner pocket. Papa said this was for his real evidence, something the bad men would never think to look for. The key was unmarked, except for a tiny symbol that Webb recognized as the mark of a Santa Fe locksmith who specialized in custom work for the territory's wealthiest families. If James Crawford had hidden additional evidence in a safety deposit box, it might contain the missing pieces needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. As they prepared to travel to Santa Fe to investigate Crawford's hidden cache, none of them noticed the figure watching the fort through a spyglass from the mesa's edge. Captain Ezra Thorne commanded an elite unit of international mercenaries who had been tracking the investigation since the train attack, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the remaining threats to their employer's operations. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and this time there would be no escape into the desert's protective embrace. The stakes had risen beyond simple murder to encompass the fate of every tribal community in the Southwest, and the enemies arrayed against them possessed resources and ruthlessness that matched their ambitions. The journey to Santa Fe required careful planning and expert knowledge of the territory's hidden trails. Colonel Webb selected a small escort of his most trusted soldiers' men who had proven their loyalty during previous encounters with corruption in the territorial government. Dr. Hartley insisted on accompanying the expedition, her medical skills potentially crucial if they encountered violence along the way. "I didn't survive 8 years on this frontier by hiding behind fort walls when good people needed help, she told Webb when he questioned her decision. Besides, that child needs medical supervision, and I suspect we're riding toward more trouble than your soldiers can handle alone. Tse prepared for the journey with the methodical efficiency of someone whose survival had always depended on reading the signs that others missed. His shoulder wound was healing cleanly under Dr. Hartley's care, but the desert crossing had taken its toll on both his body and his limited resources. More concerning was his growing certainty that they were being tracked by skilled professionals who knew the territory as well as he did. We're not the only ones interested in what James Crawford discovered. Tse warned Webb as they studied maps of the route to Santa Fe. I've seen dust clouds following our trail for the past 2 days, staying just out of sight, but maintaining perfect spacing. Professional trackers, probably military trained. Webb absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of a career soldier who had learned to expect enemies in every shadow. Then we take the long way around, he decided. Through the canyon country where horses can't follow and a small group can move faster than a large one. The route Webb selected added 2 days to their journey, but utilized terrain that favored stealth over speed. Ancient Puebloan trails wound through landscapes so harsh that even the Apache considered them nearly impassable, offering concealment at the cost of extreme physical demands on both horses and riders. Lila proved surprisingly resilient during the arduous crossing, her natural intelligence allowing her to learn quickly from Tse's example about reading water signs and conserving energy in the desert heat. More importantly, she began to open up about her father's work and the family dynamics that had led to his murder. Papa used to say that Uncle Marcus wasn't born bad. She told Tse during a rest stop in the shade of a red sandstone cliff. He said the war changed him, made him see enemies everywhere, and trust medicine more than people. Papa tried to help, but Uncle Marcus wouldn't listen anymore. What kind of medicine? Dr. Hartley asked, her professional curiosity aroused by any discussion of frontier medical practices. Little brown bottles that smelled sweet and made Uncle Marcus sleepy. Lila replied. Papa said it was soldier's medicine for bad dreams, but he was worried because Uncle Marcus needed more and more of it to feel normal. Dr. Hartley's expression darkened as she recognized the classic signs of laudanum addiction. How long had your uncle been taking this medicine? Since before I was born, Lila said. Papa told me Uncle Marcus started taking it after the war ended when the nightmares got too bad for him to sleep. But lately he was taking it during the day too, and it made him angry and confused about things that used to be simple. The timeline matched perfectly with the conspiracy's development, suggesting that Marcus Crawford's addiction had been deliberately cultivated and maintained by someone who needed a weapon within the Crawford family. The manipulation was both cruel and brilliant, turning a war hero's trauma into a tool for destroying his own brother. As they made camp on the second night, Tse noticed changes in Lila that went beyond simple physical recovery. The harsh realities of desert travel had awakened something primal in the child, a survival instinct that connected her to the land in ways that transcended her privileged upbringing. "Show me how to find water," she asked Tse as they searched for a suitable campsite. "Papa always said knowledge was the best weapon against ignorance, and I don't want to be helpless anymore." Tse found himself genuinely enjoying the teaching process, sharing lessons his grandfather had passed down through generations of desert survival. Lila proved an eager student, absorbing information about reading plant growth patterns and recognizing the subtle signs that indicated underground springs. "Your people know things mine never learned," she observed with the matter-of-fact honesty that children brought to complex subjects. "Papa said different people have different kinds of wisdom, and smart folks learn from everybody instead of thinking they already know everything." The comment revealed more about James Crawford's character than hours of official reports could have conveyed. Here was a man who had understood that cooperation produced better results than conquest, who had seen Native American knowledge as valuable rather than primitive. No wonder his family had considered him a threat to their more traditional approach to frontier expansion. Their conversation was interrupted by Webb's quiet warning that riders were approaching from the south, not the professional trackers who had been shadowing them, but a different group moving with the urgency of people carrying important news or dire warnings. Sheriff Maria Santos rode into their camp like an avenging angel, her twin Colts prominent in their holsters, and her face bearing the grim expression of someone who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for evil. Behind her rode two deputies, whose competence was evident in every line of their professional bearing. Colonel Webb. Santos acknowledged with a nod that conveyed respect without subservience. I've been tracking you for 6 hours, hoping to catch up before you reach Santa Fe, and walked into a trap that's been building for weeks. At 36, Santos ruled the mining town of Perdition with an iron fist and a reputation built on the graves of men who had underestimated her resolve. She had earned her badge by cleaning up a community where 3 previous sheriffs had died trying establishing law and order through a combination of tactical brilliance and uncompromising determination. What kind of trap? Webb asked, his military training instantly alert to tactical threats. The kind that involves territorial marshals' railroad money and enough corruption to make a politician blush. Santos replied with a dark humor that helped her cope with the realities of frontier law enforcement. James Crawford's investigation stirred up a hornet's nest that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. His safety deposit box was opened yesterday by federal warrant, and the contents have already disappeared into evidence lockers that might as well be black holes. The news hit their small group like a physical blow. If Crawford's hidden evidence had been seized by corrupt officials, their chances of exposing the conspiracy had just diminished dramatically. Without concrete proof of the arms trafficking and political manipulation, they would be reduced to making accusations that could be easily dismissed or buried. However, Santos continued with a slight smile that suggested she had not come bearing only bad news. James Crawford was smarter than his enemies gave him credit for. The safety deposit box was a decoy designed to draw attention away from his real hiding place. She produced a telegram that made Webb's eyes widen with recognition. This came through my office 2 days ago, delayed transmission from Crawford's final message before the train attack. He arranged for a backup copy of all his evidence to be stored with someone he trusted, absolutely someone his enemies would never think to investigate. The telegram was addressed to Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, in care of Fort Marcy Medical Facility, with instructions for retrieving a sealed package from a location that only she would recognize. James Crawford had been preparing for his own death, ensuring that his investigation would survive, even if he did not. The territorial authorities think they've contained the damage, Santos explained as they studied the cryptic message. They're so busy congratulating themselves on seizing the decoy evidence that they haven't realized the real threat is still out there getting stronger every day. But her arrival also brought disturbing news about the scope of their enemies' resources and determination. The men tracking you aren't just mercenaries, she warned Webb. They're part of an international organization that specializes in what they call territorial development, using violence and corruption to clear indigenous populations from valuable lands. She showed them wanted posters featuring Captain Ezra Thorne and his multinational crewmen whose criminal careers spanned 3 continents and included some of the most brutal colonial conflicts of the past decade. They were not ordinary gunfighters, but specialists in the kind of systematic terror that could break entire communities' will to resist. Why are you helping us? Tse asked, with the directness that characterized his approach to complex situations. In his experience, white officials rarely risked their careers to help Native Americans, especially when powerful interests were aligned against them. Santos met his gaze with an honesty that carried the weight of personal experience. Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while evil people take control, she replied. My family lost everything to men like these when I was Lila's age. I swore then that I'd never let it happen to someone else if I had the power to stop it. The answer satisfied Tse in ways that speeches about law and order never could have. This woman understood the personal cost of injustice and had chosen to fight against it despite the risks involved. She was an ally worth trusting, even if her methods sometimes conflicted with conventional approaches to frontier law enforcement. As they prepared to continue toward Santa Fe with this new intelligence, Lila made an observation that would prove crucial to everything that followed. "Sheriff Santos," she said with the careful precision of a child working through a complex problem, "if the bad men think they've won by stealing Papa's evidence, doesn't that mean they'll stop being so careful about hiding what they're doing?" The question revealed a strategic understanding that impressed all the adults present. If their enemies believed the threat had been neutralized, they might become careless about operational security, providing opportunities for observation and evidence gathering that would not exist while they remained fully alert to danger. "Os, that's exactly right," Santos confirmed with genuine admiration. "Sometimes the best time to catch criminals is right after they think they've gotten away with their crimes. Pride makes people stupid, and stupid people make mistakes." But their moment of strategic optimism was shattered by the sound of gunfire from the direction they had traveled, followed by the distinctive whistle of a cavalry bugle played in the pattern that meant immediate danger. Their pursuers had finally made contact with the escort that Webb had left behind to guard their back trail. The hunt had begun in earnest, and this time there would be no opportunity for careful planning or strategic maneuvering. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in terrain that offered little cover for a running fight. Survival would depend on reaching Santa Fe before their enemies could organize a coordinated assault on their position. The race toward salvation and evidence had become a race toward death itself, with the fate of every tribal community in the Southwest hanging in the balance. Santa Fe sprawled across its high valley like a collection of adobe dreams, its narrow streets filled with the intoxicating mixture of Spanish grandees, American merchants, and tribal traders that made it one of the most dangerous and exciting cities west of the Mississippi. The territorial capital pulsed with the energy of conflicting cultures and competing ambitions, where fortunes could be made or lost on the turn of a card or the whisper of a rumor. The First Bank of Santa Fe occupied a corner building on the main plaza, its thick walls and iron-barred windows testament to both the wealth and paranoia of its clientele. Manager Theodore Brennan had built his reputation on discretion and security serving clients, whose business often required both absolute confidentiality and unquestioning service. But when Dr. Hartley presented James Crawford's coded instructions along with supporting documentation from Colonel Webb, Brennan's professional composure cracked slightly. The request involved accessing materials that had been deposited under circumstances that suggested their owner had been preparing for violent death. Captain Crawford was very specific about the conditions for retrieving these materials. Brennan explained as he led them toward the bank's most secure vault. Only Dr. Hartley could access them, and only in the presence of both military and tribal representatives. He seemed to understand that trust would be essential for whatever he was planning. The vault door swung open to reveal a steel box, larger than the decoy, that had been seized by territorial authorities, its contents representing months of dangerous investigation into a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Inside were not just documents and photographs, but physical evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away by corrupt officials. The first discovery was a collection of weapons that matched descriptions from recent Apache raids, but with serial numbers that traced them directly to Army arsenals and Mexican cartel suppliers. The rifles had been deliberately provided to hostile tribes, ensuring that conflicts would escalate while giving military forces justification for increasingly harsh responses. These were sold to Geronimo's warriors through intermediaries. Webb said grimly as he examined the evidence tags Crawford had attached to each weapon. But they were also sold to militia groups who were told they needed protection from Indian raids. The same people were arming both sides of the conflict. Dr. Hartley discovered medical records that documented systematic laudanum distribution to Marcus Crawford and other vulnerable veterans throughout the territory. The records showed that addiction had been deliberately cultivated as a means of control, turning war heroes into unwitting weapons against their own communities. The dosages were calculated to maintain dependency without rendering the subjects completely unreliable. She reported with professional disgust. Someone with extensive medical knowledge was supervising this operation, ensuring that the addicts remained functional enough to carry out orders while being too compromised to question them. But the most shocking evidence was contained in a series of photographs that showed territorial officials meeting with leaders of an international criminal organization that specialized in what they euphemistically called development consulting. The meetings had taken place in locations throughout the Southwest, documenting a conspiracy that went far beyond regional corruption to encompass systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples across multiple territories. Tse studied reconnaissance photographs that showed planned attacks on 7 different tribal schools. Each assault timed to coincide with traditional ceremonies when hundreds of children would be gathered in vulnerable locations. The strategy was designed to create such horror that public opinion would support complete tribal removal, clearing the way for unrestricted resource extraction. This isn't just about stealing land, he realized with growing horror. They're planning genocide. Complete elimination of every tribe in the Southwest, making it look like the inevitable result of escalating warfare. The photographs showed meeting locations that Tse recognized from his childhood sacred places, where his people had gathered for generations to celebrate seasonal changes and maintain cultural traditions. The attacks were planned not just to kill children, but to destroy the spiritual heart of tribal communities, ensuring that survivors would be too traumatized to maintain their cultural identity. Lila discovered correspondence that revealed the financial structure supporting the conspiracy, showing how railroad investments and mineral rights were being coordinated to maximize profits from territorial development. The letters discussed tribal populations as obstacles to be removed rather than people with rights to be respected. "They're talking about us like we're animals," she said with the kind of mature outrage that came from understanding adult cruelty for the first time. "Like we don't have feelings, or families, or reasons for living where we do." But the correspondence also revealed something that gave their desperate situation a glimmer of hope. The conspiracy was larger than any of them had imagined, but it was also more fragile. The criminal organization required absolute secrecy to maintain its operations, and exposure of its methods could trigger investigations that would reach far beyond the Southwest to encompass similar operations throughout the developing territories. "Look at this," Santos said, pointing to financial records that showed the conspiracy's vulnerability to public exposure. They've invested everything in maintaining the illusion that tribal conflicts are natural and inevitable. If we can prove they've been artificially creating these conflicts, their entire operation collapses. The financial documents revealed a web of investments that depended on territorial development proceeding according to schedule. Railroad bonds, mining leases, and land speculation deals worth millions of dollars were all predicated on the assumption that tribal lands would be cleared within the next 18 months. But their moment of discovery was interrupted by urgent news from the street. One of Santos's deputies burst into the bank with information that transformed their strategic situation from hopeful to desperate in the span of a heartbeat. "Sheriff Captain Thorne's mercenaries have surrounded the building," the deputy reported breathlessly. "They've got every exit covered and are demanding that you surrender the Crawford girl and all evidence related to the territorial investigation." Through the bank's windows, they could see armed men taking positions in doorways and on rooftops throughout the plaza. These were not ordinary frontier gunfighters, but professional soldiers who moved with the coordination and discipline of a military unit trained for urban warfare. How many? Webb asked, his military mind automatically calculating tactical options. "At least 20 that we can see." the deputy replied. Probably more in concealed positions. They've got us outgunned and surrounded, but they're not making any aggressive moves yet. Seems like they want to negotiate. Santos checked her weapons with the efficiency of someone who had survived numerous similar situations. Men like Thorne don't negotiate, she said grimly. They make demands and eliminate anyone who refuses to comply. If they're holding back, it's because they need something from us that they can't get by force alone. The answer came in the form of a voice calling from the plaza, amplified by a military-speaking trumpet that carried Captain Thorne's ultimatum to everyone within a quarter-mile radius. His words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable, while making the consequences of refusal absolutely clear. Dr. Hartley Sheriff Santos Colonel Webb. Thorne's voice echoed off the surrounding buildings. You have discovered evidence of activities that affect territorial security. We represent federal authorities who require immediate access to these materials. Surrender them peacefully, and no harm will come to any civilian in the immediate area. The threat was obvious, despite its diplomatic language. Thorne was prepared to turn the heart of Santa Fe into a battlefield if they refused to cooperate, endangering hundreds of innocent people who had no connection to the conspiracy. It was psychological warfare designed to force them into an impossible choice between protecting evidence and protecting lives. He's lying about being federal authorities, Webb said with certainty. I know every federal marshal in the territory, and none of them would authorize this kind of operation in a civilian area. But knowing Thorne was lying did not solve their tactical problem. They were trapped in a building with limited ammunition and no clear escape route, facing professional killers who had every advantage except time. Eventually, territorial authorities would investigate the commotion in their capital city, but that might take hours they did not have. Dr. Hartley made the decision that changed everything. There's another way out, she announced, producing a key that she had carried for years without ever explaining its purpose. James Crawford wasn't the only person who believed in preparing for impossible situations. She led them to a section of the bank's basement that appeared to be ordinary storage space, but which concealed an entrance to the network of tunnels that connected many of Santa Fe's most important buildings. The tunnels had been constructed during the territorial period as protection against Apache raids, but they had evolved into an unofficial transportation system for people who needed to move through the city without being observed. The medical clinic is connected to this system, Dr. Hartley explained, as they gathered the evidence and prepared for underground travel. From there, we can reach the telegraph office and send word to federal authorities who aren't part of the conspiracy. But escaping the immediate trap was only the beginning of their problems. Thorne's mercenaries would not abandon their mission simply because their quarry had temporarily eluded capture, and the evidence they carried was too dangerous to allow its survival. The real confrontation was still ahead, in a location where civilians would not be endangered, but where the stakes would be just as high. As they made their way through tunnels that reeked of dampness and decades of disuse, Lila asked the question that had been troubling her since discovering the scope of the conspiracy. Why do they hate us so much? We never did anything to hurt them. Tse considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing that his answer would shape how this child understood the world for the rest of her life. They don't hate us, he said finally. They just don't see us as people like themselves. To them, we're obstacles to getting what they want, and they've convinced themselves that removing obstacles is the same thing as solving problems. But that's not true. Lila protested with the moral clarity that children brought to complex issues. People aren't obstacles. People are people. You're right, Tse agreed. But understanding that requires seeing past skin color and different ways of living. Some people never learn how to do that, especially when there's money to be made from staying ignorant. Dr. Hartley listened to their conversation with the fascination of someone who had spent years observing how different cultures approached fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. The child's ability to see past racial boundaries gave her hope that future generations might be capable of the cooperation that had so far eluded their elders. They emerged from the tunnel system into the medical clinic that Dr. Hartley had established to serve Santa Fe's diverse population, a facility where tribal healers worked alongside university-trained physicians to provide the best possible care for everyone who needed it. The clinic represented exactly the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that the conspiracy sought to destroy. "We need to get word to federal authorities who can be trusted," Webb said as they barricaded the clinic's entrances against potential attack. "But first, we need to figure out where Thorne's people will make their real move. They won't give up just because we escaped one trap." Santos studied a territorial map that showed the locations of upcoming tribal gatherings and ceremonies, looking for patterns that might reveal the conspiracy's next target. "Here," she said, pointing to Canyon Deelli, where hundreds of Navajo and Apache families were gathering for the annual harvest celebration. "This is where they'll strike next. Maximum casualties, maximum trauma, maximum justification for military intervention." The harvest ceremony was scheduled to begin at sunset, giving them less than 6 hours to prevent a massacre that would dwarf anything the territory had ever seen. But reaching Canyon Deelli would require crossing open country, where Thorne's mercenaries could intercept them, and they lacked the military resources needed to fight a conventional battle against professional soldiers. "There is another way," Tse said slowly, his mind working through possibilities that others might not have considered. "If we can't stop them from reaching the ceremony, maybe we can convince the people to leave before the attack begins." He explained his plan with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years thinking about how to protect his people from superior forces. Instead of trying to fight Thorne's mercenaries directly, they would use the telegraph system to warn tribal leaders about the impending attack, giving them time to evacuate the ceremonial grounds before the massacre could begin. "But they'll never believe warnings from white authorities," Dr. Hartley pointed out. "Years of broken promises and betrayals have made them suspicious of anything that comes through official channels." "They'll believe me," Tse said with quiet confidence. "My grandfather is one of the ceremony leaders, and my family's reputation for truth-telling goes back 5 generations. If I tell them danger is coming, they'll listen." The plan was risky and dependent on precise timing, but it offered the best chance of preventing mass casualties while preserving the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy. They would split into 2 groups. Tse and Lila would ride to Canyon Deelli to warn the tribes, while Webb Santos and Dr. Hartley would remain in Santa Fe to coordinate with federal authorities and prepare for the legal battle that would follow. But as they prepared to implement their desperate strategy, none of them realized that Captain Thorne had been listening to their conversations through an informant whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of wealth and position in the new territorial order. The trap they thought they had escaped was actually closing around them with deadly precision, and their enemies knew exactly where they were going and when they would arrive. The race to prevent genocide had become a race against betrayal itself, and the margin for error was measured in minutes rather than hours. The journey to Canyon Deelli required crossing 40 miles of desert terrain that offered little concealment from pursuing enemies or protection from the merciless southwestern sun. Tse selected a route that utilized ancient Puebloan trails, known only to tribal guides' paths that wound through landscapes so harsh that even experienced cavalry units avoided them when possible. Lila proved surprisingly resilient during the demanding ride, her natural intelligence allowing her to learn quickly from Tse's example about reading weather signs and conserving both human and animal energy in extreme conditions. More importantly, their shared ordeal was forging a bond that transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that divided their respective peoples. "Tell me about the ceremony," Lila asked during a brief rest in the shade of red sandstone cliffs that rose like cathedral spires from the desert floor. What makes it so important that people would risk their lives to attend? Tse found himself genuinely enjoying the opportunity to share his culture with someone who approached it with curiosity rather than judgment. The harvest ceremony connects us to everything that makes life possible, he explained. The land, the seasons our ancestors, and the children who will carry our traditions into the future. It's when we remember that we're part of something larger than ourselves. Like church, Lila asked, trying to understand through comparison with her own religious experience. Similar but different, Tse replied. Your churches are buildings where you go to talk to God. Our ceremonies are times when we listen to everything around us and remember that God speaks through the wind, the rain, the growing plants, and the animals that share our world. The explanation helped Lila understand why the planned attack was about more than simple murder or land theft. By targeting the ceremony, the conspiracy sought to destroy the spiritual foundation that held tribal communities together, ensuring that survivors would be too traumatized and disorganized to resist further encroachment on their territories. As they rode deeper into the sacred landscape surrounding Canyon Deelli, Tse pointed out landmarks that carried stories passed down through generations of his people. Each rock formation, each hidden spring, each ancient dwelling represented connections to ancestors who had faced their own challenges and found ways to survive in harmony with their environment. My grandfather taught me that the land remembers everything, Tse said as they approached the canyon's rim. Every footstep, every prayer, every drop of blood spilled in war or peace. That's why fighting over land is so dangerous. It poisons the memory and makes it harder for future generations to find peace. Below them, Canyon Deelli stretched like a vast green oasis carved from red sandstone, its cottonwood trees and flowing stream creating a paradise that seemed impossible in the surrounding desert. Scattered throughout the canyon floor were the temporary dwellings of families who had traveled hundreds of miles to participate in ceremonies that connected them to centuries of cultural tradition. The sight of so many people gathered in such a vulnerable location made Tse's heart race with urgency. If Thorne's mercenaries launched their attack as planned, the narrow canyon walls would turn the celebration into a killing ground where escape would be nearly impossible. Every minute they delayed increased the danger to innocent families who had no idea they were being targeted for destruction. But warning the tribal leaders required more than simply announcing that danger was approaching. Tse needed to provide specific information about the threat while maintaining the credibility that would ensure his warnings were taken seriously rather than dismissed as panic or paranoia. Stay close and let me do the talking, Tse told Lila as they descended into the canyon. Some of the older leaders remember when white children were used as spies or bait for military traps. They need to see that you're different, but that will take time we might not have. They found Tse's grandfather, Tse Begay, supervising the construction of traditional brush shelters near the ceremonial ground center. At 78, the old man moved with the careful dignity of someone whose authority came from wisdom rather than physical strength, his weathered face bearing the accumulated knowledge of decades spent reading signs that others missed. Grandfather Tse said in Navajo, using the formal address required for important announcements. I bring word of danger approaching our people. Armed men plan to attack during tonight's ceremony, making it appear that Apache warriors are responsible for the killing. Tse Begay studied his grandson's face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception in even the smallest details. Then his gaze shifted to Lila, taking in her appearance and demeanor with the kind of assessment that could determine life or death for everyone present. Who is the white child? The old man asked in English, acknowledging Lila's presence while testing her ability to understand what was being discussed. My name is Lila Crawford, she replied with the careful courtesy her father had taught her for dealing with respected elders. My papa was Captain James Crawford. He died trying to stop the bad men who want to hurt your people. Tse Begay's expression shifted as he recognized both the Crawford name and the significance of James Crawford's investigation into territorial corruption. He had been one of the few tribal leaders who had worked with the captain, providing information about criminal activities in exchange for protection against military reprisals. Your father was a man of honor, the grandfather acknowledged. But you are a child in a place of great danger. Why have you come here instead of seeking safety with your own people? Because Tse is my brother now, Lila replied with a simple honesty that cut through complex adult reasoning. And brothers don't abandon each other when bad things are happening. The statement created a stir among the gathered tribal leaders who understood the implications of claiming family bonds that transcended racial boundaries. If the child was sincere, it represented the kind of cultural bridge building that could transform relationships between Native and white communities. If she was not, it represented a betrayal that could cost lives. But Tse's grandfather had spent decades learning to read character in human faces, and what he saw in Lila's eyes convinced him that her claim was genuine. More importantly, the pendant she wore was one he had crafted years ago for his missing daughter Sarah, whose disappearance had never been fully explained. "Show me the pendant." Tse Begay commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose word could influence the decisions of hundreds of people. Lila removed the Navajo silver piece with trembling fingers, offering it to the old man, whose reaction would determine whether their warning was believed or dismissed. Joseph examined the pendant with the careful attention of someone verifying his own craftsmanship, noting details that confirmed both its authenticity and its significance. "This belonged to my daughter," he said finally. "She gave it to a white soldier who promised to protect our sacred places from those who would defile them for profit. If you carry it, then you carry her memory and her hopes for peace between our peoples." The revelation that Lila was the granddaughter of one of the tribe's most respected leaders created an immediate shift in the gathering's mood. Here was not just a white child seeking help, but a member of their extended family who had returned during a time of crisis. The symbolic importance of her presence added weight to Tse's warnings about impending danger. But time was running out as the sun moved toward the western horizon, bringing them closer to the moment when Thorne's mercenaries would launch their attack. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at sunset, and tradition demanded that it proceed according to ancient patterns that could not be easily modified or postponed. "How many armed men?" Tse Begay asked, his mind calculating the tactical options available to families who were prepared for celebration rather than warfare. "At least 20 professional soldiers," Tse replied, "armed with modern rifles and experienced in the kind of fighting that destroys entire communities. We cannot defeat them in open battle, but we can deny them the victory they seek." The grandfather nodded slowly, understanding that survival sometimes required painful choices that violated tradition in order to preserve the people who made tradition possible. "Then we will move the ceremony to the hidden canyon, where our ancestors performed the same rituals when Spanish soldiers hunted them. The sacred words remain powerful, regardless of where they are spoken. But evacuation would take time, and Thorne's mercenaries were probably already approaching the canyon through routes that would allow them to arrive precisely when the traditional ceremony was supposed to reach its climax. They needed a way to delay the attack, while ensuring that families could reach safety without panic that might result in injuries or separation. Lila made the suggestion that saved them all. "What if we make them think the ceremony is still happening in the regular place?" she asked, with a strategic insight that sometimes came from innocence. Like a play with just a few people pretending while everyone else escapes through the secret paths. The idea was both brilliant and terrifying in its implications. A small group of volunteers would need to remain in the ceremonial ground, maintaining the illusion of normal celebration, while hundreds of families slipped away through hidden routes that led to defensible positions in the canyon's upper reaches. Tse immediately volunteered to be part of the deception, as did several young warriors whose speed and knowledge of the terrain made them ideal for the dangerous task of drawing enemy fire while protecting the evacuation. But Tse Begay made a decision that surprised everyone present. "The child comes with me," the grandfather announced. "If she is truly family, then her safety is our responsibility. And if the soldiers see that we protect white children as well as our own, perhaps some of them will remember that they too have families who matter more than the orders they have been given." The evacuation began immediately, with families moving through paths so ancient and well concealed that they were invisible to anyone not specifically trained in their location. Children who had been looking forward to dancing and celebration instead found themselves part of a deadly game of hide and seek, where discovery meant death for everyone involved. As the sun touched the western rim of Canyon Deelli, Tse and his volunteers took their positions around the ceremonial ground, preparing to maintain the illusion of normal activity, while their enemies approached through the gathering darkness. In the distance, the sound of horses moving through desert scrub announced that Captain Thorne had arrived to collect the blood debt he believed was owed for the inconvenience of their resistance. The battle for the soul of the Southwest was about to begin, fought not with overwhelming force, but with courage, deception, and the kind of desperate cleverness that had allowed indigenous peoples to survive centuries of conquest and exploitation. The attack came with the methodical precision of professional soldiers who had perfected their techniques during colonial campaigns across 3 continents. Captain Thorne deployed his mercenaries in a classic envelopment pattern designed to prevent escape while maximizing casualties, each man positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the ceremonial ground into a killing zone. But instead of finding hundreds of defenseless families gathered for religious celebration, the mercenaries discovered only a handful of warriors who vanished into the canyon's maze of stone formations, like ghosts returning to the spirit world. The trap they had planned to spring instead became a deadly game of cat and mouse, where their superior firepower meant little against enemies who knew every hiding place and secret passage in the ancient landscape. Tse moved through terrain he had learned to navigate as a child, using knowledge passed down through generations of warriors who had fought similar battles against Spanish conquistadors and Mexican cavalry. His Winchester rifle spoke with careful precision, each shot calculated to inflict maximum damage, while conserving ammunition for the long night ahead. The mercenaries found themselves fighting an enemy they could barely see, taking casualties from positions that appeared empty, until muzzle flashes revealed the presence of defenders who understood that survival depended on mobility rather than firepower. Their modern weapons and military training were designed for conventional warfare, not for the kind of guerrilla fighting that turned every rock and shadow into a potential threat. Captain Thorne realized within the first hour that his carefully planned massacre had become something far more dangerous. A running battle against opponents who were fighting to protect their families, rather than simply following orders for pay. The difference in motivation would prove decisive as the engagement stretched through the long desert night. "They're gone," one of Thorne's lieutenants reported after searching the areas where families should have been gathered. The whole ceremony was a setup to draw us into an ambush. Thorne absorbed this information with the cold calculation of a professional soldier who had survived numerous similar situations. The mission parameters had changed, but the ultimate objective remained the same: eliminate all witnesses to the conspiracy, while maintaining the illusion that Apache raiders were responsible for any violence. "Then we hunt them down," Thorne decided. "These people know canyon routes that could take them all the way to Colorado. If they escape with evidence of our operations, every territorial authority from here to Washington will be asking uncomfortable questions." But hunting families through Canyon Deelli's labyrinthine passages required local knowledge that Thorne's mercenaries did not possess, and their quarry had the advantage of fighting for survival rather than money. More importantly, the delay was giving federal authorities time to respond to telegrams that Webb and Santos had sent from Santa Fe. As dawn broke over the canyon's rim, The sound of approaching cavalry announced that the territorial situation had attracted the attention of forces beyond Thorne's control or corruption. Colonel Harrison Webb led a mixed column of regular Army troops and territorial marshals who had been investigating reports of unauthorized military activity in a region where such operations required explicit federal approval. Captain Thorne. Webb's voice echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by a military-speaking trumpet that carried his words to every position where mercenaries might be hiding. You and your men are ordered to lay down your weapons and surrender for questioning regarding violations of territorial sovereignty and unauthorized military operations. Thorne's response was a rifle shot that sent echoes bouncing through the stone maze, followed by the systematic destruction of evidence that might connect his operations to their ultimate sponsors. If he could not complete his mission, he would at least ensure that the conspiracy's leadership remained protected from exposure. The final confrontation took place in the hidden canyon, where Tse Begay had led the tribal families to safety, a sacred place where ancient petroglyphs recorded centuries of cultural continuity and survival. Here, surrounded by the artistic legacy of ancestors who had faced similar challenges, the moral stakes of the conflict became clear to everyone involved. Tse found Thorne barricaded behind a natural stone formation that provided excellent defensive positions, but no escape route, the mercenary captain having chosen to make his final stand in a location where defeat would be absolute. Between them stretched open ground that offered no concealment, ensuring that their confrontation would be decided by skill and determination rather than tactical advantage. You fought well. Thorne acknowledged with the professional respect that soldiers sometimes showed for worthy opponents. But you're fighting for a lost cause. The territory will be developed regardless of how many of your people die resisting progress. Progress. Tse repeated with bitter irony. Is that what you call murdering children and stealing sacred artifacts? Is that what you call turning families against each other with lies and addiction? Their duel was interrupted by an unexpected voice calling from the canyon's rim, Lila Crawford, who had disobeyed her grandfather's instructions to remain hidden, and instead climbed to a position where she could see the entire battlefield. In her hands was her father's journal, its pages fluttering in the desert wind like prayers made visible. Captain Thorne, Lila called out with the clear authority of someone delivering an important message. My papa wrote about you in his journal. He knew you were working for Sheriff Santos and the railroad people. He knew about the stolen gold and the plans to hurt innocent families. The revelation that James Crawford's investigation had identified both Thorne and Santos created a moment of stunned silence that changed the tactical situation dramatically. If the conspiracy's leadership structure was documented in writing, then eliminating witnesses would not be sufficient to protect the operation from exposure. Thorne's moment of distraction gave Tse the opening he needed to close the distance between them, turning their long-range duel into the kind of close-quarters combat where superior knowledge of terrain provided decisive advantages. They fought with the desperation of men who understood that losing meant death, not just for themselves, but for everything they represented. The battle ended when Lila's voice cut through the chaos, with words that reached something deeper than military training or financial motivation. My papa said the best soldiers are the ones who protect people instead of hurting them, she called out. He said even bad men can choose to be good if they remember what they're really fighting for. Her words reached several of Thorne's mercenaries, who had been questioning their orders since discovering that their targets included children and families, rather than military objectives. The moral clarity of a child's voice succeeded where diplomatic negotiations and military threats had failed, causing enough hesitation to tip the balance decisively toward justice. When the shooting finally stopped, Captain Thorne lay dying among the ancient petroglyphs that recorded his people's own struggles for survival. His final words carrying an admission that would help authorities trace the conspiracy back to its sources in territorial government and railroad boardrooms. Santos, he gasped as blood flowed from wounds that were beyond any medical help. Sheriff Santos planned everything. She's not who she claims to be. The Railroad Consortium. They promised her a position in the territorial legislature if she could clear the Indians from the mineral lands. The revelation that Santos had been the conspiracy's mastermind, rather than just another law enforcement officer, caught everyone by surprise, reshaping their understanding of events that stretched back months or even years. But there was no time to pursue the implications. Immediately wounded, men needed medical attention, and families needed reassurance that the danger had finally passed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley arrived with the federal authorities, her medical kit already prepared for the casualties that such confrontations inevitably produced. As she worked to save lives that violence had threatened, she also gathered evidence that would ensure the legal proceedings to follow would be based on facts rather than speculation or political convenience. The bullet wounds matched the ballistic evidence from previous attacks. She reported to Colonel Webb as they documented the scene for federal investigators. These men were responsible for at least 6 different raids that were blamed on Apache warriors, along with the train attack that killed the Crawford family. But their most important discovery was the cache of stolen Apache sacred artifacts that Thorne's mercenaries had been transporting, gold and silver pieces whose cultural significance far exceeded their monetary value. The recovery of these items would allow tribal communities to reclaim spiritual traditions that the conspiracy had sought to destroy, along with the people who preserved them. As the sun reached its zenith over Canyon Deelli, Tse and Lila stood together among the ancient rock art that recorded their ancestors' determination to survive, despite overwhelming odds. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger work of healing and reconciliation was just beginning. What happens now? Lila asked her young mind, struggling to process the magnitude of what they had experienced and accomplished together. Now we go home, Tse replied, putting his arm around the sister who had proven that family bonds could transcend every barrier that hatred and ignorance could devise. And we build something better than what came before. In the distance, the sound of celebration began to rise from the hidden canyon, where tribal families had waited out the danger, their voices joining in songs of gratitude that had been sung for centuries, whenever communities survived threats to their existence. The harvest ceremony would proceed as planned, but with new meaning that encompassed victory over forces that had sought to destroy not just lives, but the cultural foundations that made those lives worth living. The battle for Canyon Deelli was over, but the war for justice was entering a new phase that would test everything they had learned about the power of unity to overcome division. The weeks following the Canyon Deelli confrontation brought revelations that shook the territorial government to its foundations. Sheriff Maria Santos's carefully constructed identity unraveled under federal investigation, revealing a criminal career that spanned multiple territories and included some of the most sophisticated land fraud schemes in the history of westward expansion. Her real name was Maria Consuela Vasquez, daughter of a Mexican cartel leader who had sent her north to establish connections with American criminal organizations. Her appointment as sheriff had been purchased through bribes and political manipulation, allowing her to use law enforcement resources to advance criminal operations while maintaining the appearance of fighting crime. The capture of her personal correspondence revealed the full scope of the conspiracy she had orchestrated, involving railroad executives, territorial politicians, and federal officials, whose corruption had enabled systematic exploitation of Native American communities throughout the Southwest. The evidence was so extensive that it triggered congressional investigations that would eventually lead to reforms in territorial governance. But for Tse and Lila, the most important outcome was the legal recognition of their family relationship and the return of properties that had been stolen through fraudulent land deals. James Crawford's investigation had documented not just criminal activities, but the legitimate ownership rights that Santos's conspiracy had violated through violence and legal manipulation. The Crawford family fortune, built through honest business dealings rather than exploitation, was restored to Lila's control, with Tse serving as her guardian and advisor. Together, they established the Tse Begay Foundation, dedicated to promoting cross-cultural education and economic development that benefited all territorial residents, regardless of their ethnic background. Their first project was a model community near Santa Fe, where Navajo, Apache, and white families could live and work together as equals, sharing knowledge and resources in ways that defied every social convention of their time. The community included schools where children learned in 3 languages, medical clinics that combined traditional healing with modern medicine, and businesses that proved cooperation could be more profitable than competition. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley established a teaching hospital at the Foundation's main campus, training physicians who understood that healing required attention to cultural as well as physical factors. Her innovative approach to combining Western medical knowledge with Native American healing practices became a model that was eventually adopted throughout the American frontier. Colonel Harrison Webb used his military influence to ensure that federal policies toward tribal communities reflected the lessons learned from the Santos conspiracy. His reports to Washington documented how cooperation had proven more effective than force in maintaining peace and promoting development that benefited everyone involved. The sacred Apache artifacts recovered from Thorne's mercenaries were returned to their rightful keepers in ceremonies that brought together tribal communities that had been artificially divided by the conspiracy's manipulation. The gold and silver pieces funded new schools and hospitals that served as monuments to cultural survival and renewal. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between tribal communities and territorial authorities. The exposure of systematic manipulation and violence created opportunities for dialogue that had been impossible, while corruption dominated official channels. Leaders on all sides began to recognize that their common interests outweighed their historical grievances. On a crisp autumn evening, 6 months after the Canyon Deelli battle, Tse and Lila stood together on the mesa where their relationship had begun, watching lights twinkle in the valley below, where their foundation community was growing into something that neither had imagined possible during their desperate flight across the desert. "Do you think Papa would be proud of what we've built?" Lila asked, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength through trials that would have broken many adults. "Your father died trying to protect the truth." Tse replied, his scarred face reflecting the peace that came from completing work that honored those who had sacrificed everything for justice. "He would be proud, not just of what we've accomplished, but of the woman you're becoming." At 12 years old, Lila had already demonstrated leadership abilities that impressed territorial officials and tribal elders alike. Her testimony in federal court had provided crucial evidence for convicting corrupt officials, while her personal story had inspired newspapers throughout the nation to reconsider their assumptions about race relations and Western development. The Foundation's annual report documented achievements that exceeded everyone's expectations. Cross-cultural schools were graduating students who went on to serve as teachers, doctors, and community leaders throughout the region. Agricultural cooperatives were developing techniques that increased crop yields while protecting soil and water resources. Business partnerships were generating prosperity that benefited entire communities rather than just individual families. But their greatest success was in demonstrating that cooperation could triumph over conflict when people were willing to see past superficial differences to recognize their shared humanity. The Foundation community had become a symbol of what America could achieve when its highest ideals were actually put into practice rather than just proclaimed in political speeches. "There's something else Papa would want to know," Lila said, producing a letter that had arrived that morning from federal authorities in Washington. "The territorial government has voted to grant full citizenship rights to all Native American residents, with representation in the territorial legislature and protection under federal law." The news represented a victory that went far beyond anything they had dared to hope for, during their desperate struggle against Santos's conspiracy. Legal recognition of tribal rights would provide protection against future attempts at exploitation, while creating opportunities for political participation that had been denied for decades. Tse accepted the letter with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen justice triumph over corruption through persistence and courage rather than violence. "Your father would say this is just the beginning," he told Lila. "Legal rights are only as strong as the people who defend them." As winter approached, they prepared for the Foundation's first cross-cultural celebration, a festival that would combine Navajo, Apache, and Anglo traditions in recognition of the diverse heritage that made their community strong. Children who might have grown up as enemies would instead dance together under the vast New Mexico sky, their voices blending in harmony that would have been impossible just months before. The festival would also mark the completion of the memorial they had built to honor those who had died fighting Santos's conspiracy, including James Crawford, Marcus Crawford, and the tribal members whose sacrifice had made survival possible. The monument bore inscriptions in 3 languages, declaring that some bonds could not be broken by violence or hatred, and that love remained the most powerful force in any wilderness, whether geographical or spiritual. Dr. Hartley's latest medical report showed that health outcomes in the Foundation community exceeded those in comparable settlements throughout the territory, proving that cooperation produced benefits that extended far beyond economic or political considerations. When people felt safe and valued, their physical and mental health improved in ways that strengthened the entire community. Colonel Webb's military assessments confirmed that the Foundation region had become one of the most stable and prosperous areas in the territory, with crime rates lower than anywhere else west of the Mississippi. The success challenged conventional wisdom about frontier development, while providing a model that other regions were beginning to study and emulate. As stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Tse and Lila made plans for the future that reflected their shared commitment to building something lasting and meaningful. From the tragedy that had brought them together, the Foundation would expand its educational programs to include colleges that trained teachers and doctors for service throughout the Southwest. Agricultural research would develop techniques that allowed sustainable development without environmental destruction. Most importantly, they would continue telling their story to anyone who would listen, sharing the lessons they had learned about the power of family bonds that transcended every artificial barrier their society could devise. Their experience proved that children could overcome the hatred their parents had inherited, that cooperation could triumph over conflict, and that love could heal wounds that had festered for generations. "We did it," Lila said softly, taking her brother's scarred hand in her own small fingers. "We really did build something Papa would be proud of. Like no little sister." Tse replied, his voice thick with emotion that encompassed grief for the lost and joy for the found. "We're just beginning. Our parents planted seeds in ground that seemed too hard and bitter to grow anything good. But love has deep roots, and with enough time and care, it can bloom even in the desert." The wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the valley below Navajo and Apache, and white children playing together under the stars, their voices creating the harmony that their grandparents had dreamed of, but never lived to see it. It was the sound of healing of families reunited across every divide that hatred had tried to create. In the Foundation's archives, carefully preserved alongside James Crawford's journal and the other artifacts of their shared struggle, was a simple photograph, Tse and Lila standing together on the mesa at sunset, their faces turned toward a future bright with possibility. The inscription on the back, written in Lila's careful script, captured everything they had accomplished together: family found, family kept, family forever. 5 years later, when territorial historians wrote about the period that transformed New Mexico from a land of racial conflict into a model of cooperation, they identified the Tse Begay investigation as the turning point when justice finally overcame corruption. The Foundation's success had inspired similar communities throughout the West, proving that the American promise of equality could be fulfilled when people chose courage over fear. Lila Crawford Begay had become the youngest person ever appointed to a territorial commission, her expertise in cross-cultural relations sought by government officials and business leaders throughout the region. At 17, she spoke fluent Navajo and Apache, in addition to English and Spanish, her linguistic abilities reflecting the multicultural identity that made her an effective bridge between communities that had once viewed each other as enemies. Tse Begay served as the first Native American territorial senator, his legislation protecting indigenous rights, while promoting economic development that benefited all residents, regardless of their ethnic background. His marriage to Dr. Hartley had created another symbol of successful cross-cultural cooperation, their children growing up trilingual and bicultural, in a world where such identities were increasingly common. The sacred Apache gold had funded educational institutions that graduated teachers, doctors, and engineers who carried the Foundation's cooperative philosophy throughout the Southwest. Agricultural techniques developed in the Foundation's research programs had transformed desert regions into productive farmland that supported growing populations while protecting natural resources. Marcus Crawford was remembered not as a traitor, but as a victim who had found redemption through sacrifice. His grave, marked by a monument that honored all veterans who had struggled with the psychological wounds that warfare inflicted on even the most courageous soldiers. His story became part of the Foundation's educational curriculum, teaching children about the dangers of addiction and manipulation, while emphasizing the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Sheriff Santos's criminal network had been completely dismantled, its members serving prison sentences that reflected the magnitude of their crimes against multiple communities. The legal precedents established during their trials had strengthened federal protections for indigenous peoples, while creating accountability mechanisms that made future conspiracies much more difficult to organize and maintain. The railroad companies that had funded the conspiracy were forced to renegotiate their territorial development contracts, providing fair compensation for land use, while hiring local workers and respecting environmental concerns that previous agreements had ignored. The new arrangements proved more profitable for everyone involved, demonstrating that ethical business practices could generate better long-term results than exploitation and corruption. Dr. Hartley's medical school had trained the first generation of physicians educated specifically in cross-cultural healing practices, their innovative approaches to healthcare becoming standard throughout the American frontier. Her research on the health benefits of multicultural communities had influenced federal policy regarding territorial development and indigenous rights. Colonel Webb had risen to command the entire territorial military district, his success in maintaining peace through cooperation, rather than force-earning recognition from military leaders and civilian authorities throughout the nation. His memoirs, published after his retirement, became required reading in military academies and government training programs. The mesa where Tse and Lila's relationship had begun was now a territorial monument visited by thousands of people each year who came to learn about the events that had transformed the Southwest from a region of conflict into a model of peaceful coexistence. The monument's interpretive center told their story through exhibits that emphasized the universal themes of family courage and the triumph of love over hatred. On the 10th anniversary of the Canyon Deelli battle, representatives from tribal communities throughout the West gathered at the Foundation's main campus for a celebration that honored both their shared survival and their collective achievements. The festival lasted 3 days and included ceremonies that blended traditions from dozens of different cultures, creating new forms of artistic expression that reflected the multicultural reality of the modern Southwest. Lila's keynote address at the anniversary celebration was broadcast by telegraph to newspapers throughout the nation, her words carrying a message of hope that resonated far beyond the territorial boundaries where her story had begun. 10 years ago, my brother and I were enemies by accident of birth, strangers, separated by fear and misunderstanding that had been deliberately cultivated by people who profited from division. she told the assembled crowd. Today we stand together as proof that family is not defined by blood or skin color, but by the choices we make when the world tries to tear us apart. The celebration concluded with the dedication of a new school that would train teachers specifically in multicultural education, ensuring that future generations would grow up with the knowledge and skills needed to build bridges across cultural divides. The school's curriculum included not just academic subjects, but also courses in conflict resolution, cultural appreciation, and the kind of ethical leadership that had transformed their region from a battlefield into a beacon of cooperation. As the sun set over the foundation community on that anniversary evening, Tse and Lila walked together through streets where children of all backgrounds played games that combined traditions from their various cultures. The sight of such natural cooperation represented the fulfillment of dreams that their parents had held but never lived to see realized. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found each other? Lila asked as they paused at the memorial that honored those who had died fighting for justice. I try not to think about it, Tse replied honestly. But sometimes I believe our meeting was not accidental. Perhaps the spirits of our ancestors guided us together because they knew we would need each other to heal the wounds that previous generations had been unable to close. Their story had become legend throughout the Southwest, inspiring countless other families to bridge cultural divides and work together for common goals that transcended ethnic or racial boundaries. Children grew up hearing about the Navajo warrior and the white girl who had proven that love was stronger than hatred, that courage could triumph over corruption, and that family bonds could survive any test that life could devise. In the years that followed, as the Southwest Territories achieved statehood with constitutions that enshrined the principles of equality and cooperation that the Foundation had pioneered, historians would look back on the Tse Begay story as a turning point in American development. It represented proof that the nation's highest ideals could be achieved through the choices of ordinary people who refused to accept that conflict was inevitable or that justice was impossible. The desert wind still carries stories across the mesas of New Mexico, but now they speak of unity rather than division, of healing, rather than hatred, of a future where all children can grow up believing that their heritage, whatever its color or culture, is a source of strength rather than shame. The Foundation's success had planted seeds that would bloom throughout the American West, creating a legacy of cooperation that would endure long after its founders had passed into legend. Tse and Lila's photograph remained in the Foundation's archives as a reminder that some bonds transcend every barrier that ignorance and hatred can devise, and that love, patient, enduring, and transformative, remains the most powerful force in any wilderness, whether geographical or spiritual. Their story ended not with an ending, but with a beginning, the first chapter of a new kind of family, and a new kind of hope for America itself.